Today, the world is urban. We live in a decidedly urban world. For the first time in human history, more people live in cities than do not. Much of this process has been taking place in the Western world for a little bit over a century and a half, but now the main point of urban growth in the world is taking place in the global south, particularly in China, portions of China, India, Southeast Asia, and also Africa as well. This shift to the urban has fundamentally changed the ways in which we live. It's changed the ways in which we work, in which we play, in which we love. It's even changed our mental and physical makeups. It's also fundamentally, I would argue, informed the way in which we understand space and place. And I want to just take a minute to unpack those terms. What do we mean by what we're talking about, space and place? One of the most influential thinkers on how we think about race and space, space and place, is John Locke, the English philosopher. Now, cue rolling of eyes. I know people didn't show up on a Friday night to hear me talk at length about a long-dead English philosopher, but I think it's important because Locke really illuminates some interesting things about space and place. For Locke, he argues that space pre-exists our knowledge of it. He believed that space was only visible and only comprehensible by the position of points, objects, and bodies within it. So the point at which two or more of these bodies or objects are at rest is what Locke calls place. Space and place then are dependent on each other, but Locke takes it even further. He says that if you understand race as related to place, if it's something that you can measure, if you can plot, if it becomes, as we see here, a location, it can also be commodified or monetized. So for Locke, place is a site of property. And at the turn of the 20th century, the rise of the modern city threw issues of place, space, and property into sharp relief. Questions over who can access these space, the right to acquire property, where to live, where to work, how you move through cities. And as we all know, throughout much of Western history, the rights to space and the rights to place have largely been the purview of those peoples deemed white. The challenges of these new urban realities were also especially important or especially difficult for peoples who only a few generations prior had been property themselves, that being African Americans. So how were they to negotiate these new and unfamiliar spaces? Ultimately, issues of urban space, place, and race were not simply questions of where, but also of when. Urbanization didn't just change the way people thought about space and place, it changed the ways that people thought about time. And since the rise of the modern city, it's been the pace of life, the flow, the rhythm of the modern city that struck people the most. Now, the old world was a known world. It was governed by the rhythms and seasons of the land, by planting, by harvest, by dawn, dusk, even by the tides. It's a known world. It's where one's ancestors are buried. And there was a deep connection between notions of space and place. And most people, whether you came from the American South or whether you came from the shtetls of Eastern Europe, were born, lived, and died within about the same 10-mile radius. Yet all this changed with the mass migration to cities. It unmoored people from the rhythms of the natural world, how they understood time as being something instinctive, through things such as time standardization, through electrification that turned night into day, and rapid industrialization all conspired to dramatically alter everyday temporal realities. So just as space came to be quantified, so too did time with ever-increasing precision. In the city, time truly became money. And the modern urban environment, as we see here, was awash in these symbols of time, whether they be public clocks, whether they be the punch clock of factories or the whistles signaling the beginning and end of work. And modernity also, in many ways, which can be defined by speed, by pace, also had really profound physiological impacts, I should say. I just want to read you a brief quote from a jazz historian, Joel Dinerstein, who recounts how after spending his undergraduate years in Buffalo, New York, he's from New York City to begin with, he returns to New York one spring day only to find himself knocked off his feet by the rushing crowds. So after retiring to a coffee shop to collect himself, he realized that he simply was not in gear, as he described it. So he resolved to kick himself into a higher gear in order to get himself home and make his way through the city. And this is really an example of how space, and particularly pace of the urban environment, can be embodied, can be something physiological in how people adapt. this notion of the pace of life as the flow or movement of experience that people undergo in the urban environment. When we talk of the New York Minute, that's a measure or perception of pace. New York's dynamism flows from the rapid flow of human capital and financial capital. If you stand in the middle of Times Square for 48 hours, you can feel this pace, right, in your bones. And although cities may vary in their real and imagined rhythms, the hyperkinetic character of a New York City or Chicago, or the, shall we say, somewhat less placid pace of a place such as Winnipeg or Buffalo, New York, most cities do seem to conform to a general temporal rhythm of the 5-day work week and 9-to-5 daily grind, which informs activity in certain areas of the city. At the end of the workday, most of these places empty out as hundreds of thousands of people make their way back to the surrounding suburbs. In American cities, and I would argue in some Canadian cities, this is only interrupted by a weekend pilgrimage back to the city core in order to take advantage of cultural events or sporting events. But it's in these spaces between, it's in these spaces and times between that we find the poor, the homeless, the indigent, disabled, disproportionately peoples of color. People who are largely disconnected from the schedules of the larger labor market, disproportionately dependent on social services with erratic hours and often inaccessible locations for people of limited means. All of which gives these areas a decidedly different pace, a different rhythm, populated by a decidedly different set of peoples. So what does it mean when we speak of certain urban spaces as dead or dynamic? Is it the volume of people? Is it the particular type of people? Is it a specific time? And how can the living inhabit an area which is said to be dead? To better understand these contexts, I would argue that we need to see cities as collections not just of spaces, but as collections of time, as a landscape of shifting temporal geographies. And there's some really interesting work being done on this notion of how could we perhaps overlay a temporal map of the rhythms of cities over a physical map. And you'll see here an attempt to do so by researchers, I should say, at the Federal University in Rio de Janeiro, who have done some amazing work in mapping these urban temporal geographies. In this case, they're focusing on what they say are the spatial and temporal conditions formation of social networks, namely on encounters, as they call it, as a key social event. And they have really interesting ways in which they're trying to chart that through social classes and through various other social markers. So if time is relative, then different peoples must experience time differently. And in urban America, the fault line of difference is race. Now, there was a time when this issue could be seen as black and white, urban, inner city being seen as a synonym in many ways for blackness. But since the dawn of the millennium, we've seen a real shift in this. Elizabeth Nieborn, who is a fellow at the Brookings Institute, I'll just read you a couple of quick statistics. She looked at numbers from 2010 to 2014 in the American Community Survey and found that 39% of African Americans live in the suburbs, 36% live in cities, 15% live in small metropolitan areas, and 10% live in rural communities. Just over 7% of all African Americans nationwide now live in traditional ghettos, much to, I'm sure, would be the amazement of the current occupant of the White House, who continually describes the inner cities as sites of carnage, exclusively occupied by African Americans and people of color. So, when speaking of inner city residents, the dominant characteristic is often poverty rather than strictly just race, or at least more a broadly based understanding of color. So what then are the temporal geographies of the average inner city resident? I want to just look at three main elements of this, beginning with housing. As I'm sure many of you know, for the first part of the post-war era, housing projects were the dominant form of housing available to inner city residents. They consisted of one or more concentrated blocks of low-rise or high-rise apartment buildings. They were intended to provide housing to low-income residents at below-market rates, and they were operated by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD. More than 1.2 million households currently live in public housing of some kind. Most of this form of housing, public housing, or the projects as they were called, were built under the architectural notion of defensible space. Defensible space. This encourages two of the key elements of this were to encourage a sense of territoriality, to provide residents with a sense of ownership, and to provide clear sightlines for optimal visual surveillance needed to enforce vagrancy and curfew bylaws. These spatial and temporal imperatives were built into the very bricks and mortar, with the various forms of sightlines, the way angles were utilized, the kinds of materials that were used. When you pair these with the various curfew and vagrancy statutes, it created a unique form of spatial and temporal surveillance and discipline. Ostensibly, of course, this was designed to provide residents from safety from perceived external threats, but it ended up creating an internal sense of discipline and surveillance for the residents. For many residents of the projects, their time and space was very clearly not their own. What happens then when people move out, make their way out of the projects, down into the streets, into the city streets? They often found themselves facing a similar form of temporal and spatial discipline, with joblessness rates in high-poverty urban areas nearly 3 times the national average and limited substandard educational opportunities, and the jobs that were available to people being of unskilled, low-wage, temporary jobs in the retail and service sector. Thousands of young men made their way into the streets to make a living, often involved in street-level drug economies. I don't say alternative or underground because in many of these communities, the drug trade is the economy. And this is a drug trade predicated on the violent acquisition of territory or corners or turf, which were then monetized through the sale of drugs. These same corners were spaces subjected to constant surveillance and discipline, not only from rival gangs, but from law enforcement as well, who often use long neglected vagrancy and curfew statutes to clear corners at certain times of day and place black bodies under a strict temporal and spatial discipline to keep black bodies in their place. This can't be separated from the skyrocketing prison population in the US, which, as we know, is the largest jailer in the world. It holds the greatest amount of prisoners on earth, a disproportionate number of them, of course, being black men. This chilling statistic here, provided by Michelle Alexander, the author of The New Jim Crow, that there are more black men in prison today than there were enslaved in 1850. Absolutely mind-blowing. And while black women are the fastest growing sector of the prison population. This is very much a ghetto to prison pipeline, as many scholars have described it. And for many residents, this connection between the temporal and spatial discipline they face at their homes, in the streets, is then replicated or mirrored in what they experience when they often make the inevitable trip to prison. Very much what the scholar Eduardo Mendieta notes it as, we can see the ghetto as prison and the prison as ghetto. One of the key aspects of defensible space was situating housing projects proximate to so-called desirable neighborhoods. However, as you can see here, often this proximity was physically impeded by the establishment of massive multi-lane arterial roads, coincidentally, of course, which were designed to expedite suburbanites through the city at the greatest possible rate, not to any points within the city, but to make their way through the city. So you can see the Robert Taylor homes, I don't know if you can make that out in Chicago here, which are bounded by the Dan Ryan Expressway on one side and other large arterial roads, or a very explicit example here in Syracuse, New York. This is a turn towards a car-centric urban environment, and this made residents of the projects, often who lacked the capital, of course, to invest in a vehicle, disproportionately reliant on public transit, which, as we know, at the turn of the 20th century is facing severe cases of underfunding in the face, particularly in the United States, of suburban control of regional councils and ultimate disinterest in facilitating regional transit authorities. In the words of the infamous L. Brooks Patterson, one of the most vociferous advocates of suburban sprawl in the United States. He's the chief executive of Oakland County, a very wealthy, affluent suburb that bounds Detroit, and being very clear about his intention for how the suburbs should relate to the city. What we're going to do is turn Detroit into an Indian reservation, where we herd all the Indians into the city, build a fence around it, and then throw in the blankets and corn, end quote. Of definitive means to try and confine and restrict racial undesirables, to keep black peoples, poor peoples of color, in their proper place, totally cut off from the rhythms of mainstream society. Fewer buses and trains on the street and erratic or intermediate scheduling hampers many inner city residents' attempts to move freely within the city, beyond their immediate space. And so, as the temporal and spatial isolation of the city's most vulnerable peoples increases, and as researchers at the Brookings Institute have again in a similar study proven, proximity to jobs and commute times can affect the employment outcome of a city's most vulnerable citizens. Between 2000 and 2012, residents of high poverty and majority minority neighborhoods experienced particularly pronounced declines in job proximity, sometimes spending over 3 hours on return trips to low-paying retail and service industry work. Now, this matters because people who live closer to jobs are more likely to work. They face shorter job searches and spells of joblessness. Proximity to employment proves particularly important to certain kinds of workers and residents. For instance, the duration of joblessness among Black, female, or older workers tends to be more sensitive to job accessibility than it is for other kinds of workers. For poor residents, living closer to jobs increases the likelihood of working and leaving welfare. So from the project to the streets to work to the simple ability to move through the city, to make one's way through the city, poor peoples of color find themselves confronted with what's been termed a carceral logic at every turn, a logic of punishment and confinement that's rooted in specific manifestations of time and space. So in conclusion, even when we turn to the language of urban renewal or gentrification, it's often weighted with certain assumptions of race, space, and time. Too often, the peoples we wish to renew, or more accurately, remove, are seen as impediments to progress. Given our linear understanding of progress, this places these people as peoples literally out of time, where one set of peoples, mainly peoples of color, come to represent renewal, while others, as you can see in this advertisement here for a redevelopment in Dalston Square in London, are seen as representative of best and forgotten and regrettable past, whose physical presence must be removed from these renewed or rejuvenated spaces. As Locke reminds us, place is not neutral. It's a site of property. It's a socioeconomic construction. Place is constantly being contested by socioeconomic, cultural, and political forces. Forces that I would argue can be better understood through a temporal lens, and that we see that time and place are functions of power. Plain and simple, time and place are rooted in power to determine who can access it, who can own it, who can monetize it, and more importantly, who cannot. Time reveals the contours of urban inequality. It links the micro inequalities of the day-to-day life of people, the daily minutiae of bus schedules, vagrancy statutes, curfew violations, work, shift work, to the macro systems of racial inequality and structural racism. And of course, this is not an exclusively American problem. I've talked at length today about specifically American issues, but this is something that defines urban environments across the globe. We see how difference and inequality are mediated by spatial and temporal dynamics. If nothing else, conceiving of the city not simply as a collection of places, but also as a collection of times, a set of flows, of rhythms, can help denaturalize the seemingly natural entities we think of time and space, that we don't really give too much thought as to how they develop. It can help architects, city planners, and citizens and the like conceive of the way that tempo and flow can inform or impact on social equality or inequality. The temporal geographies which shape and constrain inner city residents are not accidental. They are the result of historical design. And while we may not be able to make up for the mistakes of the past, while we may not be able to make the decisions of the past unmade, if we adopt new ways of looking at spatial and temporal dynamics of urban inequality, it can perhaps better inform the making of more equitable urban environments that do not hold its most vulnerable citizens hostages to times past. Thank you.